Preface. The document that changed everything. In the winter of 1952, a professor of archival sciences named Dr. Edmund Hargrove was cataloging a shipment of unclaimed academic materials donated to a small university library in upstate New York. Most of the boxes contained the expected debris of forgotten careers: outdated textbooks, personal correspondence, yellowed lecture notes. But buried beneath a stack of Czech physics journals, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax, was something extraordinary. It was a handwritten manuscript, 41 pages. The handwriting was cramped but precise, the ink still dark despite the years. The language was English, though certain phrases carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who had learned it as their third or fourth tongue. The manuscript had no title page, no author attribution, and no date. But scattered throughout its margins were symbols, triangles, spirals, and a recurring sequence of numbers: 3, 6, 9. Dr. Hargrove spent 3 years attempting to authenticate and trace the document. He never conclusively identified the author, but what he found inside those 41 pages was, by his own account, not a scientific document, not a philosophical treatise, and not a religious text, but somehow, impossibly, all three at once. The manuscript described a theory of mind so radical, so precise, and so far ahead of its time that Hargrove quietly photocopied it, locked the original in his personal safe, and spent the remaining decades of his life quietly testing its principles. He reportedly told a single colleague, "Whoever wrote this didn't just understand how the mind works. They understood how the mind works on the universe." The document you are now reading is not that manuscript, but it is built on the same foundation, the same principles that visionaries, inventors, healers, and creators have quietly known for centuries, and that modern neuroscience, quantum physics, and consciousness research are only now beginning to confirm. This is a book about one thing: how your thoughts become your reality. Not metaphorically, not poetically, physically, measurably, undeniably. And by the time you finish reading, you will never be able to unknow what you are about to learn. The Invisible Architecture. Chapter 1. The Laboratory Inside You. There is a version of the story most people know. The genius dies alone. The hotel room, the pigeons on the windowsill, the stacks of papers no one will read for decades. History's greatest electrical mind, penniless and forgotten, leaving behind nothing but a handful of patents and a cautionary tale about what happens when innovation outpaces public understanding. That version is true, and it is almost entirely irrelevant, because the real story, the one that matters to you sitting here reading this, isn't about electricity at all. It's about what happened after the machines. It's about what a man who had spent 50 years studying the nature of energy finally concluded in the silence of his own mind in the last years of his life. He concluded that he had been studying the wrong laboratory. The external world, the coils, the towers, the crackling arcs of artificial lightning, was only ever a reflection of something deeper, something he had been too busy building to properly examine. And in those final years, when the funding was gone and the projects were canceled, and the noise of the world had finally quieted enough for him to hear himself think, he turned his attention inward. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew. We are going to begin with a question most people never ask. Not, how do successful people think? Not, what habits do high achievers have? Those questions, while useful, are surface level. They describe behavior without explaining mechanism. They tell you what to do without telling you why it works. The question we are going to ask is more fundamental. What, exactly, is a thought? Not what a thought feels like, not what it's about, but what it actually is, physically, energetically, in terms of its relationship to the matter and events that make up your daily life. Because here is what the science, real science, peer-reviewed, replicated, increasingly irrefutable, is telling us. A thought is not just an idea. A thought is a signal. It is an electrochemical event that produces measurable electromagnetic fields. It alters hormone production, changes blood chemistry, influences the behavior of your immune cells, and, this is where it gets genuinely extraordinary, appears to have measurable effects on systems outside the body. Researchers at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab spent nearly 3 decades studying what happens when human intention is directed at random number generating machines. The machines, by definition, should produce perfectly unpredictable results. Focused human intention caused those results to deviate from chance at odds that, accumulated across thousands of trials, could not be explained by coincidence. The effect was small, the mechanism remains debated, but the effect was real. And if a thought can influence a machine, what can it do to a life? The architect who didn't know he was building. Let me tell you about a man named Marcus Webb. In 2009, Marcus was a 34-year-old structural engineer in Chicago. By every external measure, he was succeeding. He had a good salary, a condo in Lincoln Park, a fiancée named Claire, and a career trajectory that pointed steadily upward. He worked hard, he was competent, he followed the rules, and he was quietly, persistently, profoundly miserable. Not the dramatic misery of crisis, no addiction, no breakdown, no single catastrophic event. Just a low, constant hum of dissatisfaction. The feeling that he was building other people's structures while his own life remained somehow undesigned, that each morning he was picking up someone else's blueprints and following someone else's plans. I felt like a passenger in my own life, he told me years later, like I was watching someone else make all the decisions. What Marcus didn't realize, what almost no one realizes, is that he was, in fact, the architect of everything he was experiencing, not consciously, not deliberately, but with absolute precision. Every morning, Marcus woke up and thought, "Another day. I hope it goes okay. I'm already behind." He ate breakfast while mentally rehearsing the obstacles of the day ahead. He commuted while cataloging everything that could go wrong in the next 8 hours. He arrived at work already exhausted by a day that hadn't happened yet, and the day, obligingly, confirmed his expectations. This is not mysticism. This is neuroscience. The brain, your brain, is a prediction machine. Its primary function is not to accurately perceive reality, but to generate predictions about reality and then selectively attend to evidence that confirms those predictions. This is called the predictive processing framework, and it is now one of the most widely accepted models in cognitive neuroscience. What this means, in practical terms, is that what you habitually think becomes what you habitually see. What you train your mind to expect becomes what your mind is wired to find, and what your mind is wired to find becomes, experientially, functionally, your reality. Marcus wasn't just thinking negative thoughts. He was building a negative architecture, laying invisible foundations every morning that the rest of his day would then proceed to occupy. The frequency nobody taught you about here is a metaphor that one of history's most obsessive minds reportedly loved, and that modern physics has since made far more than metaphorical. Picture a radio. A radio doesn't create music. It doesn't generate the signals it receives. It simply tunes to a frequency, aligns its internal oscillation with an external signal, and sound emerges. Change the frequency, and you get an entirely different broadcast, The radio has not moved. The world outside has not changed. Only the alignment has shifted. Now, here is what that same brilliant, obsessive mind understood, and what took neuroscience decades to catch up with. Your mind works the same way. Every thought you have, every emotion you sustain, every belief you carry, these are not just mental events. They are frequencies. They are patterns of electromagnetic activity that pulse outward from your nervous system and interact with the world around you in ways that are only now being systematically mapped. This is not a metaphor. Electroencephalography measures the frequency of your brain waves. Heart rate variability research reveals that the electromagnetic field produced by your heart extends several feet beyond your body. Studies in interpersonal neurobiology show that humans in close proximity literally synchronize their neural oscillations. Their brains begin to broadcast on matching frequencies. You are, whether you know it or not, constantly broadcasting. The question, the only question that actually matters, once you understand this, is, what frequency are you on? What Tesla actually discovered? There is something genuinely strange about the final years of that famous inventor's life, and it is this. The man who had built his entire career on the mastery of external energy sources became, in those quiet final years, increasingly focused on something else entirely. In notes that surfaced decades after his death, found in various archives, translated by various scholars, debated by various academics, a consistent theme emerges. Not electricity, not wireless transmission, not the technological projects that had consumed his public life. The theme was consciousness, specifically the relationship between consciousness and matter, between thought and reality, between the invisible architecture of the mind and the visible architecture of the physical world. He wrote in fragments about what he called the laboratory of the mind, the idea that the human imagination was not a pale shadow of reality, but its actual precursor, that everything physical was first constructed in the invisible realm of thought, feeling, and intention, and only then, through processes that science had not yet named, materialized into the tangible world. He described designing his most complex inventions not on paper, but in his mind, running them through thousands of simulated tests, correcting their flaws in the invisible laboratory before ever touching a physical component. He reportedly told colleagues that by the time he built something, it was already finished, that the physical construction was merely a formality, a kind of three-dimensional tracing of something that had long since been completed somewhere else. "When I close my eyes," he reportedly wrote, "I enter a laboratory more precise than any I have built. In this laboratory I do not imagine machines. I experience them, their weight, their sound, their imperfections, their corrections. By the time I bring them into the world, they have already lived." This is not the biography they teach in school, but it is, increasingly, the biography that science is confirming. The three levels of creation. Every reality, every relationship, career, physical condition, circumstance, achievement, and obstacle in your life was created at one of three levels. Level 1. The surface. This is where most people operate. They react to circumstances, make decisions based on visible information, take actions in response to events. They are, in the most literal sense, being led by their reality rather than leading it. Life happens to them. Level 2. The pattern. A smaller group of people understand that surface events are produced by deeper patterns, habitual ways of thinking, believing, and emotionally responding that create predictable outcomes. These people work to change their patterns, their habits, their mindset, their relationships with fear and possibility, They experience significantly different results than Level 1 operators. Level 3. The frequency. This is where the profound shift occurs. A rare few people, not saints, not geniuses, not the specially gifted, but ordinary humans who have learned something specific, understand that patterns themselves are produced by even deeper frequencies. The fundamental signal their consciousness is broadcasting into the world. At Level 3, change doesn't happen through willpower or habit formation or positive thinking. It happens through a fundamental shift in what you are emitting. When the frequency changes, everything built on that frequency changes with it. Circumstances, opportunities, relationships, health, creativity. All of it reorganizes around the new signal. This book is about Level 3. Not because Levels 1 and 2 don't matter. They absolutely do. But because without understanding the frequency beneath the patterns, beneath the behaviors, you are always fighting symptoms rather than addressing the source. The invisible blueprint. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. You are already creating your reality. You have always been creating it. The only question is whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously. Most people are unconscious creators. They generate thoughts without examining them, sustain emotions without choosing them, carry beliefs without questioning them, and then wonder why their outer circumstances seem to reflect some internal landscape they never deliberately chose. The engineer in Chicago, Marcus Webb, was unconsciously creating a life that felt like a waiting room. He wasn't doing anything wrong, exactly. He was just doing it asleep. The first step is to wake up, not to some mystical, elevated state, not to a permanent condition of bliss and enlightenment, but to a simple, factual, scientifically grounded understanding. Your thoughts are not passive. They are active. They are not observers of reality. They are participants in its construction. Once you understand this, really understand it, in your body as well as your mind, you cannot go back to treating your thoughts as background noise. You begin to realize they are the signal, the broadcast, the invisible architecture of the world you inhabit. And that means they are also the key to changing it. The promise of this book, what you are about to read, is not a collection of affirmations or motivational strategies. It is a map, as precise as the author can make it, of how consciousness actually creates physical reality. We will explore the neuroscience of thought frequency and why your habitual thinking literally rewires your brain, the physics of intention and what serious researchers have discovered about mind-matter interaction, the role of the subconscious mind as the engine that runs most of your life on autopilot, and how to reprogram it, the specific practical mechanisms by which imagination, emotion, and belief combine to produce physical outcomes. The lost technology of words, how the specific language you use speaks directly to your nervous system in ways that alter your biology and your experience. The relationship between time, consciousness, and the reality you are moving toward. And we will do all of this through stories, through science, and through the kind of honest, unflinching examination of how human experience actually works. Not how we wish it did, not how it looks from the outside, but how it operates in the invisible architecture beneath everything visible. Because the truth is this: the most powerful laboratory in the world is not in a research university. It is not in a Silicon Valley startup or a government black budget facility or the hidden archives of any intelligence agency. The most powerful laboratory in the world is the space between your ears, and you've been inside it your whole life without ever reading the manual. Until now. The Subconscious Engine. Chapter 2. The Program Running Your Life. In 1987, A cellular biologist named Dr. Elaine Roth made a discovery so uncomfortable that she spent 2 years trying to disprove it before she accepted it was real. She wasn't studying consciousness. She was studying how cells respond to environmental signals, the relatively straightforward biochemistry of how a cell detects a chemical in its environment and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Standard stuff. The kind of research that fills journals without making headlines. But then she began looking at something more subtle. What happens to a cell's receptors, the molecular antennas that pick up environmental signals, when the signals themselves are invisible, when the influence is not a chemical in the medium, but a thought in the mind of the researcher? She tried everything to make the effect disappear. Blind protocols, double-blind protocols, controlled environments, statistical corrections. The effect did not disappear. Focused human intention was altering the behavior of cells. Not dramatically, not in ways that would let you skip chemotherapy or grow a new kidney, but measurably, consistently, in directions that corresponded with what the researcher was intending. Dr. Roth wrote in her private notebooks, published posthumously by her daughter, "I became a biologist to understand life. I think I may have stumbled onto the thing that actually runs it." The iceberg problem. Here is a number that should stop you cold: 95%. That is the percentage of your daily mental activity that neuroscientists estimate occurs below the threshold of conscious awareness. Your conscious mind, the part that is reading this sentence, forming opinions about it, deciding whether to agree, is responsible for roughly 5% of your cognitive processing. The other 95% runs on autopilot. This autopilot, the subconscious mind, is not inferior to conscious thought. It is not primitive or unreliable. In many ways, it is vastly more powerful. It runs your heartbeat, your immune system, your balance, your breathing, your emotional reactions, your habitual judgments, your reflexive beliefs about who you are and what is possible for you. And here is the crucial point. It was programmed primarily in childhood by experiences you didn't choose in a state of consciousness you didn't control. By the time you were 7 years old, the core operating system of your subconscious mind was largely installed. Your fundamental beliefs about safety and danger, about whether you are loved or lovable, about whether the world is generous or withholding, about whether you are capable or limited. These were written into the architecture of your nervous system by the experiences of your earliest years. And unless you have done something specific to rewrite them, they are still running. This is why people read self-help books and feel inspired and then find themselves behaving exactly as they always have within a week. It's not weakness, it's not lack of motivation, it's the 95% overriding the 5%. The conscious mind says, "I want to change." The subconscious mind says, "I don't recognize this new pattern. I'm going to run the familiar one instead." The subconscious wins, almost every time, until you learn how to talk to it in its own language. The language the subconscious understands. Here is what most approaches to personal change get wrong. They try to change the subconscious using conscious tools. Willpower is a conscious tool. Logical reasoning is a conscious tool. Positive affirmations repeated mechanically without emotional engagement are conscious tools. They have their place, but they operate in the 5% of the mind that is the least powerful and the most easily overridden. The subconscious mind does not speak the language of logic. It speaks the language of image, emotion, and repetition. Think of it like this. Your subconscious is not reading the text of your thoughts. It is watching the movie. It doesn't care what the narrator is saying. It responds to what the screen is showing, what the music is making it feel, and how many times the same scene has played. The single mother in Seattle who has struggled financially for 15 years despite working hard, getting promoted, and making all the right financial decisions. She has almost certainly been running a subconscious movie about money that was filmed in childhood. A movie that says money is scarce, security is fragile, success brings envy and danger, and no amount of conscious effort to think positively about abundance will change her outer circumstances as long as that movie keeps playing. To change the movie, you need to change the screen, the music, and the repetition. You need to speak the language the subconscious actually understands. And that language, image, emotion, repetition, is also, not coincidentally, the language of every spiritual tradition, every effective therapy, every lasting transformation that humans have ever undergone. What actually happened in Marcus Webb's life? Remember Marcus Webb, the Chicago engineer who felt like a passenger in his own life? Here is what happened to him, and I promise you, it is not the story you are expecting. In 2011, 2 years after the conversation I described, Marcus didn't find a new job or meet a guru or have a spiritual awakening on a hiking trail. What he did was far more boring and far more powerful. He changed his morning, not dramatically. He didn't start meditating for 2 hours, or writing in a gratitude journal, or reciting affirmations in the mirror. What he did was this. For 5 minutes each morning, before he got out of bed, he lay still and deliberately placed a specific image in his mind. The image was of himself, not as he currently was, but as he intended to be. Working on a project he cared about, in a city he loved, with a sense of genuine engagement, genuine purpose, genuine aliveness. He didn't try to believe it. He didn't try to convince himself it was real. He simply held the image and allowed whatever feelings arose to be present with it. Some mornings it felt hollow. Some mornings it felt forced. He did it anyway. For 3 months, nothing obviously changed. Then things began to change in ways he couldn't have predicted and didn't orchestrate. A former professor reached out about a consulting project in Portland, a city Marcus had always been drawn to but never seriously considered moving to. He took the project. While there, he met people who were working on exactly the kind of structurally innovative, ecologically responsible construction he had always found interesting but never pursued. He didn't manufacture any of this. He didn't network his way to it. He simply recognized it when it appeared, because he had spent 3 months training his mind to look for it. Within 18 months, Marcus had relocated to Portland, was doing work that engaged him fully, and had ended a relationship that, once he was honest with himself, had been sustained by the same low-level resignation that had characterized the rest of his life. "Nothing happened the way I thought it would," he told me. "I never got the things I pictured in those morning sessions, but I got something better, the things I actually needed. It's like the exercise wasn't about manifesting specific outcomes, it was about tuning my antenna." He used the word antenna without knowing its history, without knowing that a brilliant mind in a New York hotel room had spent his final years writing about exactly the same thing. The reprogramming mechanism. So how, specifically, does this work? Here is the mechanism, laid out as clearly as modern science allows. Step 1. Image. When you hold a vivid mental image, particularly in a relaxed low beta or alpha brainwave state, the state you're in just before sleep, just after waking, or in deep relaxation, your brain processes that image in the same neural circuits it uses to process actual experience. The brain, in the state of relaxed focus, does not reliably distinguish between a vivid imagined event and a real one. This is why trauma works so insidiously. the traumatic memory replays in the same neural tissue as the original event, reinforcing the same pathways, keeping the same fear response active. And it is why positive directed imagination works. It creates new pathways, new associations, new default patterns of perception and response. Step 2. Emotion. A mental image without emotional engagement produces weak, temporary results. Emotion is the amplifier. Emotion is what converts a thought from a suggestion into an instruction. When you hold an image and allow yourself to feel what it would feel like if that image were your reality, not pretending, not forcing, but genuinely inviting the feeling, you trigger a biochemical cascade. Neuropeptides are released, hormones shift, cellular receptors are altered. The body begins to change in response to a reality that exists, so far, only in the mind. The HeartMath Institute has documented this extensively. Emotional states produce measurable changes in the electromagnetic field generated by the heart, a field that extends several feet beyond the body and interacts with the nervous systems of people nearby. Your emotional frequency is not just an internal experience, it is a broadcast. Step 3. Repetition. New neural pathways require repetition to become dominant. This is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on experience. But neuroplasticity requires consistency. A single vivid imagining creates a faint new pathway. 100 vivid imaginings, sustained over weeks, begins to carve a new channel. This is why spiritual traditions across cultures have insisted on daily practice, not because God needs to hear from you every morning, but because the subconscious mind requires consistent repetition to update its operating system. Image, emotion, repetition, the trifecta, the language the 95% actually speaks. The woman who healed the wrong way. In 2016, a woman named Diane Castellano was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that her doctors described as manageable but permanent. She was 41 years old, a marketing executive in Atlanta, and she had 2 children under 8 and a stubbornly optimistic personality that her rheumatologist initially found somewhat exhausting. She did everything her doctors told her to do. She also did something they didn't tell her to do. Every evening, after her children were asleep, she sat in the small reading chair in her bedroom and spent 20 minutes doing something she described to those who asked as visiting my healthy self. She would close her eyes, slow her breathing, and systematically move her attention through her body, not to catalog pain or dysfunction, but to imagine each system healthy, each process functioning, each cell doing exactly what it was designed to do. She didn't try to override her symptoms with positive thinking. She simply held the image of her body operating with ease and allowed whatever warmth or relief or simple quiet arose to accompany the image. "I wasn't delusional," she said later. "I knew I had the condition. I wasn't pretending I didn't. I was just practicing a different version of myself alongside the version I was actually living." Within 14 months, her inflammatory markers had dropped to levels her rheumatologist described as atypical. Not cured, she was careful about that word, and so am I. But measurably, documentably better in ways her medical team could not fully account for. Was it the subconscious programming, the emotional work, the placebo effect, which is itself simply the body's response to the mind's expectations? It doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is that it worked, and that it worked through the exact mechanism we are describing: sustained, emotionally engaged imagination, practiced with enough repetition to begin rewriting the body's default program. The skeptic's question. At this point, a reasonable skeptic might ask, isn't this just the placebo effect? Isn't this just optimism bias? Isn't this simply the well-documented tendency of humans to notice and remember the evidence that confirms their expectations? Yes, in part. But just the placebo effect is an absurd diminishment of one of the most powerful forces in human biology. The placebo effect heals people. It reduces pain, clears infections, shrinks tumors, resolves symptoms that pharmaceuticals have failed to touch. The placebo effect is the mind's actual, measurable, documented power to alter physical reality. Calling it just the placebo effect is like calling electricity just electrons moving around. Technically accurate, completely missing the point. And confirmation bias, the tendency to notice confirming evidence, is actually the mechanism by which mental programming creates real-world outcomes. If you have spent years training your mind to notice evidence of scarcity and limitation, you will be surrounded by scarcity and limitation, not because it's the only thing available, but because it's the only thing you are wired to perceive. Change the wiring and you perceive different things. Different things lead to different choices. Different choices lead to different outcomes. This is not magic. This is not wishful thinking. This is the most practical, most precise, most powerful technology available to any human being on Earth. And it lives inside your skull, running right now, whether you are directing it or not. What you didn't know, you were building. Let's return for a moment to the metaphor of the architect. Imagine you hired an architect to design your home, but this architect worked exclusively at night while you were sleeping, using plans you had accumulated unconsciously over decades, fragments of your parents' fears, your early experiences of loss or inadequacy, your unexamined beliefs about what you deserve and what is possible for you. Every morning you wake up in a house you didn't consciously design. You try to rearrange the furniture, repaint the walls, add new fixtures, but the bones of the building, the load-bearing walls of your subconscious programming, remain unchanged, and the architect keeps working at night, reinforcing the same foundational patterns. This is the situation most people are in. The good news, the genuinely extraordinary good news, is that you can fire that architect, or rather, you can become that architect. You can begin, deliberately and systematically, to draft new plans, to redesign the foundational structure of the reality you are creating, not in a single dramatic moment of transformation, not through some guru's technique or some weekend seminar, but through the simple, powerful, relentlessly consistent practice of speaking the language your subconscious actually understands. Image, emotion, repetition. This is the engine. In the chapters ahead, we are going to learn how to run it. The signal and the noise. Chapter 3. Intuition, the technology you were never taught to use. In 1969, a NASA engineer named Robert Fairfield sat in a conference room in Houston, staring at a trajectory problem that had his entire team stumped. They had been working the numbers for 11 straight hours. The math kept producing solutions that were technically valid, but somehow, in ways Fairfield couldn't articulate to his colleagues, wrong. "I know this sounds insane," he reportedly said, "but every solution we put on that board makes me feel like we're going left when we should be going right. And I can't tell you why." His supervisor, a methodical man named Gerald Okafor, who had approximately zero patience for what he called gut feelings dressed up in physics, told Fairfield to go home, sleep, and come back with equations, not feelings. Fairfield went home. He slept, and in the 90-second window between sleep and waking, that strange, borderless state where the analytical mind has not yet fully engaged, a complete solution arrived in his mind. Not a clue, not a direction, a complete solution, fully formed, internally consistent, elegant in a way that the 11 hours of conscious deliberation had not managed to produce. He checked the math on the way into the office. It was correct. Robert Fairfield spent the rest of his career quietly obsessed with that 90-second window. He wrote in unpublished notes that he came to think of intuition not as a lucky accident or a cognitive shortcut, but as a different kind of data retrieval, one that doesn't run through the bottleneck of conscious processing. He was right, and it took neuroscience about 40 more years to catch up with him. What intuition actually is, strip away the mysticism, and intuition reveals itself as something both more and less miraculous than people tend to think. More, because it is genuinely accessing information that your conscious mind does not have, not through supernatural means, but through the brain's extraordinary capacity for unconscious pattern recognition, somatic signaling, and what researchers are increasingly calling non-local information processing. Less, because it is not infallible, not always accessible, and not a replacement for clear thinking. Intuition is a tool, not an oracle. Here is what happens neurologically when you have an intuitive experience. Your brain is constantly processing an enormous volume of sensory and experiential information, far more than consciousness can handle. The vast majority of this processing happens below awareness. Your unconscious mind is identifying patterns, making associations, running comparative analyses against decades of stored experience, all without your conscious knowledge. When this processing produces a result that is relevant and urgent, it sends a signal up to consciousness. But because the route it takes bypasses the analytical cortex, the signal arrives not as a logical argument, but as a feeling, a certainty without reasons, a knowing without evidence. The somatic markers hypothesis, developed by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, proposes that the body itself is involved in this signaling, that the gut sensation, the chest tightening, the sense of expansion or contraction that accompanies intuitive knowing is not metaphorical, it is literal. The body is sending data. Which means the old dismissal, that's just a gut feeling, we need real data, is precisely backwards. The gut feeling is data. It is the output of an extraordinarily sophisticated processing system that runs faster, processes more information, and accesses deeper pattern libraries than anything your conscious analytical mind can produce. The question is not whether to trust intuition. The question is how to hear it clearly. The problem with the modern mind, here is the inconvenient truth. The way most Americans currently live makes intuition almost inaccessible, not because we are unintelligent, not because intuition requires special gifts, but because intuition requires, above all else, silence. And silence is something the modern environment works very hard to prevent. We wake to alarms and immediately check devices. We commute to podcasts, radio, or the internal monologue of worry. We work in open offices where sustained focus is structurally impossible. We eat while watching, drive while listening, exercise while consuming. We fill every interstitial space, every waiting room, every elevator, every moment of transition with stimulation. The signal-to-noise ratio of most people's mental environment makes it very nearly impossible to hear the quiet voice of intuitive knowing. It isn't that the signal isn't there. It's that we have surrounded ourselves with so much noise that the signal can't get through. The engineers and artists and scientists who describe their best work arriving out of nowhere tend to share a common practice, whether or not they frame it this way. They create conditions for silence. They take long walks. They take long showers. They stare out windows. They create deliberate gaps in the noise. These are not accidents of biography. They are the conditions under which the deeper processing system can finally report its findings. The retreat that wasn't in 2020, a tech entrepreneur named Jordan Hayashi was 6 months from launching a company that his investors were excited about, his advisors were enthusiastic about, and he himself was increasingly, inexplicably, terrified of. Not normal pre-launch anxiety, not imposter syndrome. Something more specific, a persistent low-frequency wrongness that he couldn't locate in any particular fact or number or market condition. Everything looked right. Something felt completely wrong. He had two choices. He could dismiss the feeling as noise, which every rational advisor in his life was encouraging him to do, or he could investigate it. He investigated it. He told his team he was taking a week offline, no email, no calls, no screens. He drove to a friend's cabin in Vermont, left his phone in the car, and spent 7 days doing very little except walking, cooking, reading physical books, and sitting in the unstructured silence that his life had not contained in years. On the 4th day, the feeling resolved itself into something specific enough to examine. The problem wasn't his product. The problem was his co-founder, not in a dramatic fraud or betrayal way, in a subtler, more fundamental way. They didn't share the same core values about what the company was for, about what success meant, about whose interests came first when interests conflicted. These misalignments had been visible in small moments, in how his co-founder talked about users, in which metrics he prioritized, in how he responded to questions about the company's social impact. Jordan had noticed all of this, consciously, but he had chosen not to examine it because examining it was inconvenient, because the timeline was tight, because investors were enthusiastic. His subconscious had been screaming about it for months. In the noise of his regular life, he couldn't hear it. In the silence of the Vermont woods, he couldn't avoid it. He returned to Boston, had a series of very difficult conversations with his co-founder, and ultimately restructured the partnership in ways that were painful and expensive. The launch was delayed by 4 months. 3 years later, his company has made decisions in those difficult moments of value conflict that he could not have made with his original structure intact. He has said, publicly, that the 4-month delay and the pain of the restructuring were the best investment he ever made. "I almost built a machine I didn't believe in," he said in a podcast interview in 2022. "My head was on board. Everything on paper made sense. But something in me, something I almost didn't listen to, knew it was wrong. I've never been more grateful for a bad feeling in my life." The difference between intuition and anxiety. Here is something crucial, because confusing these two is genuinely dangerous. Intuition feels like knowing. Anxiety feels like warning. Intuition tends to be quiet, specific, and calm, even when its content is uncomfortable. It does not spiral or catastrophize. It does not loop endlessly through worst-case scenarios. It simply points, with persistent clarity, at something real. Anxiety is loud, non-specific, and escalating. It generates scenarios rather than information. It amplifies rather than clarifies. It is almost always about the future rather than the present. When Jordan Hayashi sat in silence and the feeling resolved into something specific and actionable, that was intuition. When he had been lying awake at 3 a.m. running through catastrophic launch scenarios, that was anxiety. Both are signals from your nervous system, but they are pointing at very different things. Intuition says, "Look here." Anxiety says, "Be afraid." The practice of distinguishing between them is one of the most valuable cognitive skills a human being can develop, and like all skills, it requires practice. Specifically, the practice of sitting with your own internal experience long enough and quietly enough to hear the difference. The intuition upgrade. There is good news for those of us who have spent years drowning out the signal with noise. Intuition can be recovered, cultivated, and strengthened. The mechanism is the same as for any skill. Practice in conditions that allow the skill to develop. Condition 1. Scheduled silence. This doesn't mean meditation, though it can. It means creating regular daily periods of unstructured quiet, no inputs, no outputs, no agenda, even 10 minutes. The brain needs time to process without direction. Research on the default mode network, the neural system that activates during restful, unfocused states, shows that this apparently idle brain activity is anything but idle. It is when your brain integrates information, consolidates learning, makes novel associations, and produces the insights that you later experience as arriving out of nowhere. They don't arrive out of nowhere. They arrive out of the default mode network, which only activates when you stop giving your brain something else to do. Condition 2. Body awareness. Because intuition often arrives through somatic signals, sensations in the chest, the gut, the throat, developing body awareness is a direct path to developing intuitive acuity. This can be as simple as pausing several times a day to notice, what am I feeling physically right now? Where in my body is it? What quality does it have? Most people in modern professional environments have learned to be almost entirely disconnected from their bodies during waking hours. Reconnecting is not difficult, but it is deliberate. Condition 3. Decision journaling. One of the most powerful practices for building intuitive trust is to begin tracking your intuitive hits and misses. When you have an intuitive sense about something, a person, a decision, a direction, write it down before you act. Then track what happens. Most people who do this for 3 months are startled by how accurate their intuitive assessments were, even when they didn't act on them. The evidence that their deeper knowing was reliable was available all along. They simply hadn't been looking. The frequency of intuition. There is one more thing worth saying about intuition, and it brings us back to the framework we have been building throughout this book. Intuition is not random. It does not distribute its gifts equally, regardless of the conditions of the receiver. Intuition flows most freely in a mind that is not consumed by fear. This is not a moral observation. It is a physiological one. Fear, chronic background fear of the kind that characterizes the nervous systems of most adults in modern societies, shifts the brain into a threat detection mode that is highly attentive to danger signals and highly attentive to familiar patterns, and very poorly equipped to receive genuinely new information. A frightened mind is not a stupid mind. It is often a very intelligent mind, deployed in the wrong direction. It is processing enormous amounts of information, but processing it through the filter of what could go wrong, which makes it systematically less available to the quieter signal of what is actually true. The practices in this book, the work of raising your mental frequency, clearing the subconscious of old fear programs, learning to direct imagination and emotion toward what you want rather than what you fear. These are not just about creating better outer circumstances. They are about creating the inner conditions in which your deepest intelligence can finally be heard. When the fear quiets, something opens. And what opens in that space is not imagination. It is not wishful thinking. It is not the voice of some external divine intelligence speaking through you, though some people choose to frame it that way. What opens is you, the full spectrum you, the you that has been processing your entire life's worth of experience and quietly working on your most important questions without your permission or your knowledge. That version of you has answers. The only question is whether you are going to be quiet enough to hear them. The Technology of Language. Chapter 4. The Words That Are Writing Your Life. In the early 2000s, a research team at the University of Michigan conducted an experiment that was, by the standards of psychology research, almost absurdly simple, and yet its implications have continued to ripple through neuroscience and behavioral science ever since. They gave participants one of two word puzzles to complete before performing a task. One group's puzzle was loaded with words related to old age: bingo, wrinkled, Florida, gray, forgetful. The other group's puzzle contained neutral words with no age associations. Then both groups walked down a corridor to the next stage of the experiment. The group who had been primed with aging-related words walked significantly more slowly. They had not been told anything about aging. No one had suggested they walk slowly. Their minds had simply been briefly immersed in a cluster of concepts, words, and their bodies had responded. Without their knowledge, without their consent, their nervous systems had received an instruction and complied. This is what language does, not just in psychology experiments. Every single day, in your head and in the heads of every person you speak to. Words are not neutral containers for meaning. They are frequency generators. Each word carries an embedded emotional signature, a cluster of associated memories and physical responses, a microdose of neurochemistry. And the words you use most, to yourself, about your life, are administering that neurochemistry on a continuous basis. You are medicating yourself with your vocabulary. The question is whether you are prescribing yourself something useful. The self-talk audit. Here is an exercise that most people find uncomfortable, which is why most people don't do it. For one full day, pay attention to the words you use to describe your own life. Not just the dramatic statements, not "I'm a failure" or "I'll never get what I want." The small stuff, the throwaway lines, the reflexive responses. "I'm so busy I'm losing my mind." "I always do this." "Why does this always happen to me?" "I can't help it, I'm just like this." "God, I'm such an idiot. This is impossible." "I'm exhausted. I hate this." "Nothing ever works out." These statements feel trivial. They feel like venting, like harmless complaining, like the verbal equivalent of sighing. They are not trivial. Every one of these statements is an instruction being received by a nervous system that does not evaluate the evidence, does not ask whether the claim is accurate, does not filter for hyperbole. It simply receives the signal and begins adjusting its behavior to match the described reality. "I'm so busy I'm losing my mind" activates a stress response that makes you less able to handle your workload effectively. "I always do this" reinforces a neural pathway that makes this more likely to happen again. "Nothing ever works out" trains your reticular activating system, the brain's attentional filter, to notice evidence of things not working out and to discount or overlook evidence of things going well. You are not just describing your reality, you are generating it. The neuroscience of self-directed speech, research on self-talk, the internal and sometimes external language people use to narrate their own experience, has accelerated dramatically in the past decade, and the findings are genuinely striking. Self-talk alters biochemistry. Specific categories of self-directed language, statements of capability, of positive expectation, of confident intention, produce measurable changes in cortisol levels, immune function, cardiovascular response, and pain tolerance. This is not motivational theory. This is endocrinology. Self-talk shapes perception. Language activates associated neural networks, which primes perception. If you tell yourself repeatedly that you are creative, Your brain begins selectively attending to moments of creative thinking, making creative connections more available and frequent. If you tell yourself you are not a creative person, the opposite occurs. The belief, expressed in language, reshapes the filter through which you experience the world. Self-talk influences others. The mirror neuron system means that other people's nervous systems are actually resonating with yours during interaction. The frequency you carry, including the frequency established by your self-talk habits, is detectable and contagious. People who habitually use language of confidence, possibility, and engagement tend to create those states in others. People who habitually use language of limitation and complaint tend to create those states in others, too. Your words are not just talking to you, they are broadcasting. The man who stopped saying he was unlucky. In 2014, a small business owner in Phoenix named David Reyes came to what he described as rock bottom. His third business in 8 years had failed. He was 47 years old, $180,000 in debt, and had told everyone he knew at every available opportunity that he was just one of those unlucky people. He said this casually, ruefully, with the self-deprecating humor of someone who has made peace with a fixed fact. He said it at dinner parties and in business meetings and on first dates. He said it so often that it had become a kind of identity statement, a way of organizing his sense of self around a story of helplessness. David's cousin, a therapist in Tucson named Maria Reyes, finally said something to him that changed his life. She said, "Do you know what you're doing when you say that? You're telling your brain it's not worth trying. You're giving your nervous system permission to stop looking for opportunities, because why would it bother? You've already decided." David was skeptical, but he was also out of options. He made one change. He stopped saying he was unlucky, not replaced with forced positivity, not "I'm so blessed" or "everything happens for a reason," just stopped. When he caught himself about to say it, he said nothing instead. For the first month, he said nothing felt different. The second month, he noticed he was paying more attention. Not strategically, not consciously, just paying more attention in general, as if some background static had decreased. In the third month, he ran into an old contact at a hardware store in Phoenix who mentioned an opportunity that 6 months earlier David would have dismissed as unrealistic. This time, he asked questions. He followed up. He did the work. Within 2 years, David Reyes had launched a fourth business, modest, carefully built, grounded in lessons from his 3 failures, that turned its first profit in month 9. He has sustained it for 6 years. He didn't win the lottery. He didn't receive a windfall or a lucky break. What he received, when he stopped broadcasting the frequency of unluckiness, was the ability to see what had probably always been there. The words changed, the perception changed, the behavior changed, the outcomes changed, in that order, always in that order. The 3 categories of language to transform, based on decades of research in cognitive science, linguistics, and behavioral psychology, and the observation of real people making real changes. Here are the 3 categories of language most consistently associated with lives that feel stuck and the alternative framings that open things up. Category 1, permanent language. I'm always like this. This never works for me. I'll never be able to. It's just who I am. Permanent language tells your brain that the situation is fixed, that neuroplasticity doesn't apply here, that this particular feature of reality is not available for revision. Every one of these statements is factually incorrect, almost regardless of what the "this" is. The brain can change. Behavior can change. Circumstances can change. When you use permanent language, you are actively working against the change you claim to want. Alternative framing. So far, I've tended to. Up until now, I've found it hard to. I haven't yet figured out how to. These framings describe history while leaving the future open. Category 2. Universal language. Everything is a mess. Nobody ever supports me. Nothing works. The world is against me. Universal language converts specific problems into cosmic patterns. A single bad experience becomes a universal law. One unsupportive colleague becomes a defining fact about all human relationships. The problem with universal language is that it instructs your brain to organize experience around a sweeping narrative that is almost always inaccurate, and that then becomes, through the mechanism of selective attention, a self-fulfilling lens. Alternative framing. This particular situation feels overwhelming. I haven't found the right support yet in this area. This specific approach isn't working. These framings preserve accuracy while removing the totalizing narrative. Category 3. Victimhood language. Why does this always happen to me? I can't help it. It's their fault. If only external circumstance were different, I could. Victimhood language is among the most insidious because it often contains real truths, real injustices, real obstacles, real ways in which external circumstances have genuinely limited opportunity. Acknowledging these truths matters, but framing identity around them converts a description of circumstances into a statement about fixed reality. The language of agency, not toxic positivity, not denial, but genuine agency, asks, given these circumstances, what is available to me? It does not pretend the circumstances aren't real. It simply refuses to let them be the final word. Alternative framing? This is genuinely difficult, and I'm looking for what I can influence. I can acknowledge this was unfair and ask what I do next. These framings hold complexity without surrendering agency. The words that heal. Here is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about language as a technology. It appears to operate on biology, directly. Dr. Masaru Emoto's famous water crystal experiments, in which water exposed to different words and intentions produced different crystal structures when frozen, remain scientifically controversial in their methodology. But the underlying premise they point toward has been confirmed through more rigorous means. Studies on hospitalized patients have shown that the language used by medical staff during procedures affects recovery outcomes, even when patients are under general anesthesia. Post-surgical patients who heard phrases like, "Your body is healing well," and "the procedure went smoothly," recovered faster and required less pain medication than those who heard neutral or negative language. Their conscious minds did not register these words. Their nervous systems did. This means that language is operating at a level below conscious processing, directly on the physiological systems that regulate healing, immune function, and stress response. What does this tell you about the words you use toward yourself every day across a lifetime? A woman in her mid-40s who has been telling herself, "I'm so tired, I'm falling apart, I can't keep this up," every evening for 15 years has been administering 15 years of that signal to her immune system, to her cardiovascular system, to the cellular repair processes that keep her body functional. And a woman who has replaced even a fraction of that language with, "My body is capable. I'm getting stronger. I'm recovering well." She is not being naive or delusional. She is doing something far more practical. She is upgrading her medication. The 369 of language change. Here is a framework borrowed from the kind of numerical thinking that has fascinated mathematicians, mystics, and engineers for centuries, and that happens to map elegantly onto how language-based change actually works. 3. Awareness. The first stage is simply noticing, not changing yet, just becoming aware of the language you habitually use in your self-talk, in your conversations, in the stories you tell about your life. This typically takes about 3 weeks of conscious attention. 6. Replacement. The second stage is active substitution. When you catch a limiting phrase, you replace it, not with its opposite, not with forced positivity, but with a language pattern that is accurate, open, and agency-oriented. This typically takes another 6 to 8 weeks to begin feeling natural. 9. Integration. The third stage is when the new language stops being effortful and begins being automatic. The neural pathways associated with the new language patterns have been reinforced enough to begin operating as defaults. At this stage, around 9 months of consistent practice, most people report that the changes in their inner landscape are beginning to produce visible changes in their outer circumstances. Not because of magic, not because the universe heard their affirmations and decided to reward them, but because their perception has shifted, their self-concept has shifted, their behavior has shifted in thousands of small, daily, compounding ways, and all of that, accumulated over months, looks from the outside like their life is changing. It is, because they are. A final note on authentic language. None of this is an argument for pretending, for papering over genuine pain with relentlessly upbeat language, for denying difficulty or minimizing real injustice, or performing a positivity that bears no relationship to your actual experience. That kind of language is its own form of inauthenticity, and the subconscious, which is very good at detecting the difference between what you are saying and what you actually believe, is not fooled by it. Hollow affirmations repeated without emotional authenticity produce hollow results. What this is an argument for is precision and agency. Not everything is great when it isn't, but this is hard and I am not done, not I am so blessed and grateful for every challenge, when what you actually feel is exhausted and angry. But I am exhausted, I am still here, I am looking for what comes next. Authentic language that names reality and maintains agency, that honors truth and refuses to surrender to it. That is the language of someone who is writing their life rather than reading it. And that difference between writing and reading, between creating and observing, between generating reality and merely responding to it, is precisely what this entire book is about. The Creative Consciousness. Chapter 5. You are the author. How to finally write the story. You meant to live. There is a type of shift that happens in human beings. I have seen it described in research data, and I have seen it described in the faces of people who have lived through it. That is unlike any other kind of change. It is not the shift of acquiring new information. It is not the shift of adopting new habits. It is not even the shift of healing old wounds, though it often includes that. It is the shift of recognizing what you actually are, not who you are, not what you've done or failed to do, not your story, your identity, your diagnoses, or your achievements, but what you fundamentally are, as a unit of consciousness operating in a universe that is, as the physicists increasingly suggest, more mind-like than matter-like at its deepest levels. When this shift happens, something permanent changes. Not everything in a person's life immediately transforms. Not all their problems dissolve. Not all their old patterns vanish. But the relationship between the person and their reality changes. And that relationship is the hinge on which everything else turns. The universe is not a machine. For about 300 years, the dominant metaphor for the universe in Western science was mechanical. The universe as clockwork, reality as a vast, indifferent mechanism governed by fixed laws, rolling forward according to rules laid down at the beginning of time. In this metaphor, consciousness was either irrelevant, The strict materialist view, you are your brain is matter, matter follows fixed laws, end of story, or embarrassingly mystical, you are a soul mysteriously attached to a body, the soul operates in a realm science cannot access, sorry, we can't help you. Neither of these positions is adequate to what the evidence now suggests, because the evidence suggests something far stranger, far more interesting, and far more relevant to your daily life. The universe is not a machine. It is, at its most fundamental level, an information system. And consciousness is not a passenger in this system. It is a participant in its construction. This is not New Age speculation. This is the conclusion of serious physicists, John Wheeler, David Bohm, Roger Penrose, among others, who have spent careers staring at what quantum mechanics is actually telling us. What quantum mechanics is actually telling us, in its most unnerving interpretation, is that physical reality is not definite until it is observed, that the act of observation, of measurement, of conscious attention, does not merely detect physical reality, but participates in determining it, that the universe, at its most fundamental level, is not a collection of things. It is a collection of possibilities, and consciousness is part of what converts possibility into actuality. You are reading this with a brain that is itself a quantum system, a system of organized biological complexity that produces the experience of consciousness through processes that are not fully understood and that appear to involve quantum-level phenomena that classical physics cannot account for. You are not a passenger in a machine. You are a conscious node in an information system that is actively constructing what it experiences as real. This is the scientific context for everything we have been discussing. This is why thoughts affect biology, why imagination shapes outcomes, why language rewires the brain, why sustained emotional states alter the body's chemistry, why intention appears to have detectable effects on physical systems outside the body, not because of magic, because of physics. The time question. In 2017, researchers at the University of British Columbia published a study that caused a minor furor in consciousness research. Using a variation of a well-replicated experimental paradigm, they found evidence that the human brain processes information in response to stimuli before those stimuli are consciously registered, and, in some cases, before the stimuli are presented at all. The implication, carefully hedged, thoroughly caveated, and still vigorously debated, is that consciousness may not be strictly time-bound in the way our experience suggests. This sounds like science fiction. It is not. It is the leading edge of a field that is producing increasingly consistent evidence for something that human, intuitive experience has been reporting for as long as records exist. That time is not the linear, one-directional highway we experience it as, that the future is not absent from the present, that it is present in the present, available, in some sense, to a consciousness capable of reaching toward it. The stories of breakthrough scientists, artists, and entrepreneurs are full of accounts of this phenomenon. The solution that arrived before the problem was consciously articulated. The creation that felt like discovery rather than invention, the decision that, in retrospect, seemed to have been made before the conscious mind weighed in. What if these were not flukes? What if the part of you that processes time differently, the part that dreams, that intuits, that receives, was regularly reaching into the non-linear time-space of possibility and bringing back information? And what if you could deliberately cultivate this capacity? The practice of future memory. Here is one of the most powerful practices in this entire book, and also one of the most misunderstood. It is sometimes called visualization, but that word has been so thoroughly co-opted by sports psychology, pop science, that it has lost its precision. It is better understood as future memory. the deliberate practice of experiencing, in the present moment, a version of yourself that exists in the future, not hoping for it, not picturing it like a photograph, experiencing it with the full sensory and emotional richness of actual memory. The reason this works, neurologically, is the same reason Marcus Webb's 5-minute morning practice worked, the same reason Diane Castellano's healing visualization worked. The brain processes vivid imagined experience in the same neural circuitry as actual experience. Future memory that is sufficiently vivid, sufficiently emotional, and sufficiently repeated begins to register in the nervous system as past experience. And the nervous system orients toward consistency with past experience. When you create, through repeated future memory practice, a detailed and emotionally rich experience of a version of yourself that is healthy, effective, purposeful, and thriving, your nervous system begins to treat that version of yourself as the baseline, as the norm you are returning to, rather than the goal you are trying to reach. This is not a small distinction. It changes your entire orientation. Trying to reach a goal is effortful, anxious, uncertain. You are moving toward something unfamiliar, fighting the resistance of the nervous system's preference for the known. Returning to baseline, coming back to who you actually are, to a self that you have already, neurologically, experienced as real, is natural, inevitable, like water flowing downhill. How to practice future memory. The conditions matter. You cannot do this effectively while checking email or half-watching television. The brain needs to be in a relaxed, receptive state, low beta or alpha waves, in which the analytical, skeptical frontal cortex is quieted enough to allow the deeper limbic system and sensory cortex to engage fully. The easiest way to access this state is at the natural thresholds of sleep, in the 10 minutes after waking, before full alertness has engaged, and in the 10 minutes before sleep, as the analytical mind begins to relax its grip. In this state, first, choose one specific domain, not my whole life being better. One specific area, health, work, a relationship, a creative project, too broad, and the practice becomes diffuse. Second, experience yourself as you intend to be, not watching yourself like a film, being yourself. First person, present tense. Notice what you are doing, notice what you are feeling, notice the specific sensory details of the environment, what you hear, smell, touch. Third, let the emotion be real. This is the step most people skip because it requires a kind of vulnerability. Actually allow yourself to feel what it would feel like, the satisfaction, the ease, the particular quality of being at home in this version of your life, not forced, not performed, genuinely invited and allowed. Fourth, practice without attachment to timeline. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive instruction. The practice works less well when it is driven by desperate urgency, by a clinging need for things to happen by a specific date. Bring the feeling of trust, not passive resignation, but active trust, the kind an experienced navigator feels who knows their instruments are accurate and their destination is real. Do this for 7 to 12 minutes, daily, for 90 days. Not every session will feel profound. Some will feel mechanical or hollow or distracted. That is normal. The consistency matters more than the quality of any individual session. You are not trying to have an experience. You are training a system. The coherence principle. Here is what most people miss about why this practice works or doesn't. It doesn't work when the content of the future memory is fundamentally incongruent with a deeper, subconscious belief. If you spend 12 minutes every morning experiencing yourself as financially abundant, and then spend the other 23 hours and 48 minutes operating from the subconscious belief that money is dangerous, shameful, or unavailable to someone like you. The 12 minutes will struggle to compete. This is why the inner work, the clearing of subconscious programming, the changing of self-talk, the cultivation of intuition, the raising of emotional frequency, is not optional preliminary work. It is part of the same work. Future memory practice is most powerful when it is running with the current of your deeper beliefs rather than against them, which means that if you find the practice consistently feeling hollow, flat, or implausible, that is information. That is your subconscious telling you where the incongruence lies. That is where to look next. The woman in the difficult marriage. In 2019, a woman named Patricia Holloway was 3 years into what she quietly knew was a fundamentally broken marriage. She was 53 years old, a high school history teacher in Cincinnati, practical, private, and deeply skeptical of anything that smelled like self-help. She picked up a version of these ideas from an unlikely source, a documentary about neuroscience she watched at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. Something in the section on neuroplasticity caught her. The idea that the brain, at any age, could physically restructure itself in response to consistent new inputs. She didn't visualize her marriage improving. She wasn't naive enough for that, and the marriage was too far gone. Instead, she began practicing something more honest, experiencing herself, in the future, living with integrity. Whatever that meant. She didn't specify the outcome. She just consistently practiced the feeling of being in a life that felt aligned with who she actually was. Within 6 months, she had begun a conversation with her husband that had been avoided for years. Within 18 months, they had separated, which was painful, disruptive, and, by her own account, also liberating in ways she had not anticipated. Within 2 years, she had moved to a smaller city she loved, was teaching at a school where the culture felt genuinely aligned with her values, and was in the early stages of a relationship with a person she described as the first person I've actually been honest with in 20 years. Nothing happened the way I imagined it, she said. The future I practiced wasn't a picture I was moving toward. It was more like a direction, a compass, and the compass pointed me somewhere I didn't expect, but once I got here, I recognized it. That is how this works. Not as a vending machine. Insert visualization, receive specific outcome. As a compass, as a recalibration, as the quiet insistence of your deepest knowing on the direction of genuine aliveness. The integration. What you now know. Let us assemble what we have covered, because the picture is worth seeing whole. You are a conscious system broadcasting a continuous signal through the electromagnetic activity of your brain and heart, through your behavior, through your language, through your emotional baseline, that interacts with the world in ways that are measurable, consistent, and consequential. That signal is shaped primarily by your subconscious programming, the 95% of your mental activity that runs on patterns installed, mostly in childhood, and updated primarily through repetition and emotional intensity. You can change the signal through the deliberate, consistent use of imagination, emotion, and repetition, the language the subconscious actually understands. This is not willpower. It is not positive thinking. It is a specific technology with a specific mechanism, and it has been confirmed by enough converging research that its dismissal as mysticism is no longer intellectually honest. Your language is part of the signal, not just a reflection of your inner state, but a generator of it. The specific words you use in your self-talk and your speech are continuously administering a neurochemical prescription to your own biology and broadcasting a frequency to everyone around you. Your intuition is a real faculty with a real physiological basis, accessing real information that your conscious analytical mind cannot reach through its normal channels. And it works best in conditions of silence, safety, and freedom from chronic fear. Time is more available to you than you think, not as a mystical assertion, but as a practical reality, demonstrated in the simple fact that where your consciousness is oriented, toward past, present, or future, toward fear or possibility, determines what you are capable of perceiving, and therefore what you are capable of acting on. None of this requires special gifts, not extraordinary intelligence, not unusual sensitivity, not rare spiritual qualities. It requires practice, consistency, and the willingness to take your own inner life seriously as a subject of investigation and cultivation. The only requirement. There is one thing this work requires that no book can give you. It requires a decision, not a commitment to a technique or a daily schedule or a set of practices. Those matter, but they are downstream of something more fundamental. The decision is this: to treat your own consciousness as real, as consequential, as the actual source of your experience rather than a passive commentator on circumstances beyond your control. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the more radical things a person can do, because we live in a culture that is extraordinarily invested in the opposite message, in the idea that your life is determined by factors outside you, that success is a matter of the right connections and the right market timing, and the right genetics and the right economy. That consciousness is just something that happens while you wait for external circumstances to change. The research does not support this picture. And more importantly, the experience of every person who has made the shift we are describing in this book does not support it. You are not a passenger. You are not a victim of your circumstances, your biology, your history, or your previous programming. Not permanently, not inevitably. You are, to a degree that would genuinely surprise you if you experienced it fully, the author. Not of every event that happens to you, not of every challenge that arises. Life is full of genuine randomness, genuine hardship, genuine forces that operate outside your control. But the meaning you make of those events, the direction you walk in response to those forces, the frequency you choose to maintain while the world does what worlds do, that is yours. That has always been yours. You just needed the manual. The beginning, not the end. Here is the last thing I want to say to you, and I mean it without sentimentality or performance. The person who is reading this final page is not the person who began the first. Not dramatically. Not in any way that is necessarily visible from the outside, but something has shifted. Some neural circuitry has been activated, some framework has been laid down, some door has been pushed slightly open. That was not open before. That is enough. More than enough, because this kind of change doesn't happen in a single reading. It happens in the return, in the rereading, in the practice that begins after the book is closed, the morning 5 minutes, the adjusted language, the attentive silence, the conscious future memory, the slow, patient, consistent recalibration of the signal you are broadcasting. It happens in the decision, made fresh each morning, to be the author and not the reader, to be the architect and not the tenant, to be, in the only sense that actually matters, the creator of the life you are living. The most sophisticated technology on Earth is not in any laboratory or server farm or research facility. It is in you. It has always been in you. You just woke up to it. Now use it. Epilogue. 3 months later, Marcus Webb called me on a Tuesday morning in October from a cafe in Portland that he goes to every morning before work. He called not with news, but to say something he had been thinking about. I think the strangest thing about all of this, he said, is how normal it feels now. Not ordinary. I don't mean ordinary. I mean natural. Like the way things are supposed to work. Like I was the entire time trying to steer a car from the back seat, and now I'm just in front. What's different? I asked. Nothing is different, he said. Everything is different. Same city, same field, same basic version of myself. But I'm not watching anymore. I'm not waiting for someone to give me the life I want. I'm building it. Quietly, every day, in the 5 minutes before I get out of bed, in the way I talk to myself when something goes wrong, in the things I've started saying out loud about what I believe is possible. He paused. It's embarrassing, actually, how simple it is, he said. You'd think changing your life would be harder than this. I told him I thought it was exactly as hard as it needed to be. Which is, he asked. Harder than most people are willing to do consistently, I said, and easier than everyone is afraid it will be. He laughed. We said goodbye. He went back to work, in Portland, on his terms, with his antenna finally properly pointed. The body as antenna? Chapter 6. Your biology is listening. The mind-body frequency loop. In 2003, a study published in the journal Psychosomatic Medicine documented something that continues to generate discussion in medical research more than 2 decades later. Researchers tracked a group of medical students through their final exams, one of the most reliably high-stress experiences in modern professional life, and measured the activity of a specific enzyme called telomerase, which is responsible for maintaining the protective caps on DNA known as telomeres. Shorter telomeres are associated with accelerated cellular aging and increased disease risk. Telomerase is the enzyme that repairs and extends them. During the exam period, most students showed predictable telomerase reduction. Their bodies, under stress, were allocating resources away from cellular maintenance and toward the immediate demands of crisis response. But a subset of students showed something different. Their telomerase activity remained stable or even increased during the exam period. The differentiating factor was not their academic preparation. It was not their sleep quality or their diet or their exercise habits. It was the psychological framework through which they interpreted stress. Students who experienced the exam period as a threat, something happening to them demanding survival, showed telomerase decline. Students who experienced the same objective stressors as a challenge, something they were engaged with, moving through, capable of handling, maintained their telomerase activity. Same external stress. Dramatically different biological response. The difference was a story, a frame, a mental narrative. Your body is not independent of your mind. It is its most faithful audience. The intelligence of the body. Modern medicine, for all its extraordinary achievements, has been built on a conceptual model that is increasingly difficult to defend. The model of the body as a sophisticated biological machine that processes inputs, generates outputs, and breaks down according to predictable mechanical laws. This model has produced vaccines, surgical techniques, pharmaceutical interventions, and diagnostic technologies that have extended and improved human life in ways that no previous era could have imagined. It has been spectacularly useful. It is also incomplete, because the body is not a machine. It is a field. It is an extraordinarily sophisticated information processing system that is in constant two-way communication with the mind, with the environment, and, this is the part that mainstream medicine continues to grapple with the beliefs, expectations, and emotional states of the person inhabiting it. The AC, Adverse Childhood Experiences, studies conducted across hundreds of thousands of participants over decades, have produced perhaps the most dramatic evidence of this. Early childhood experiences of trauma, neglect, or chronic stress produce measurable specific changes in adult health outcomes, not just psychological outcomes, but physical ones. Higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of autoimmune disorders. The body remembers what happened to the mind. Decades later, in the cells of organs the child never thought about, the emotional history of a childhood lives on in altered gene expression, modified immune function, changed inflammatory responses. If early emotional experiences can alter physical biology across an entire lifetime, what are your current emotional experiences doing to your biology right now? And, more importantly, what could different emotional experiences do? The stress response you didn't know was optional. Here is a biological process most people experience every day without understanding that it is, to a significant degree, under their influence. The stress response, the cascade of hormonal, neurological, and physiological changes triggered by the perception of threat, evolved for one purpose: short-term survival. When a genuine physical threat is present, the stress response is not just useful, it is life-saving. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the system, diverting resources from long-term maintenance to immediate performance. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, digestion slows. The immune system pulls back from active surveillance to preserve energy for the more pressing emergency. This cascade was designed for threats that lasted minutes: a predator, a fall, a physical confrontation. It was not designed to run continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as a background response to the daily pressures of modern American life. But for most people, that is exactly what it does. Chronic low-level stress, the kind produced not by acute crises but by persistent financial pressure, relationship tension, performance anxiety, background fear, and the kind of identity-level uncertainty that a rapidly changing world generates, keeps the stress response partially activated almost continuously in most adults. And the body, faithfully following the mind's signals, maintains the physiology of threat response: elevated cortisol, suppressed immune function, reduced cellular repair, altered gene expression, chronic inflammation. This is not a metaphor for feeling bad. This is the literal biological mechanism of chronic disease, and it is, in significant measure, driven by the mind's interpretation of its circumstances, which means the mind's reinterpretation of those circumstances can begin to reverse it. The coherent heart. The HeartMath Institute in Boulder Creek, California, has spent 3 decades studying a phenomenon they call heart coherence, a state in which the rhythm of the heart becomes smooth, ordered, and regular, producing measurable changes in brain function, hormone levels, immune response, and cognitive performance. The state of heart coherence is produced by specific emotional experiences: appreciation, care, compassion, genuine positive feeling. Not forced positivity. The research is clear that manufactured emotions don't produce the effect, but authentic, felt, positive emotional states. In the coherent state, the electromagnetic field generated by the heart, which is 50 to 60 times more powerful than the brain's electromagnetic field, becomes organized and expansive. It reaches further into the space around the body. It interacts more powerfully with the nervous systems of people nearby. In the incoherent state, produced by stress, anxiety, frustration, or chronic fear, the heart's electromagnetic field is disordered. Its signal is, in a very literal sense, noisy. What does it mean that your heart is broadcasting an electromagnetic field several feet beyond your body, and that the quality of that broadcast is directly shaped by your emotional state? It means that the vibe you give off is not a casual metaphor. It is a measured electromagnetic reality. People respond to it because their nervous systems are literally detecting it. It means that creating conditions for genuine positive emotional experience, not as a luxury or a self-indulgence, but as a biological maintenance practice, has measurable effects on your health, your cognitive function, and the quality of every interaction you have. And it means that the question, "How do I feel right now?" is not a navel-gazing indulgence. It is a monitoring question about the signal your body is broadcasting into every relationship, every room, and every cell. The practice of somatic dialogue. One of the most powerful and least utilized tools for working with the mind-body frequency loop is a practice I call somatic dialogue, a structured, deliberate conversation between the conscious mind and the body's intelligence. This is not visualization. It is not affirmation. It is something more immediate and more subtle, the practice of asking the body questions and developing the capacity to hear its answers. Most adults in modern societies have learned to treat the body as a vehicle, something to be managed, maintained, and occasionally ignored when it sends inconvenient signals. Back pain is suppressed with ibuprofen. Fatigue is overridden with caffeine. The tight chest of anxiety is pushed through with willpower. The body's signals are acknowledged as problems to be solved, not information to be received. Somatic dialogue reverses this relationship. It begins with a simple practice. Once a day, for 5 minutes, direct your attention systematically through your body, not to fix anything, not to change anything, but simply to notice, to check in, to acknowledge the body's current state the way you would acknowledge the state of someone you care about. Where is there tension? Where is there ease? What areas feel energized, and what areas feel heavy or dull? Is there a sensation somewhere that seems to be asking for attention? Many people find, when they first begin this practice, that their bodies have been trying to communicate urgently and have been systematically ignored. The persistent tightness in the shoulders that has been there for 6 months, the chronic low-grade headache that only appears on workdays, the inexplicable fatigue that descends every Sunday evening. These are not mechanical malfunctions, they are communications. The body, processing experiences that the conscious mind has not fully examined, expressing in its own language what the mind has been unwilling to address. When you begin to listen, genuinely listen with curiosity rather than judgment, something happens that most people find genuinely surprising. The body begins to respond to being heard. Tension that has been held for months begins to shift. Not because you fixed it, because you finally acknowledged it. This is not mysticism. This is the basic relational dynamic of any intelligent system that has been trying to be heard. What chronic illness is actually saying, I want to be careful here because this territory is genuinely sensitive and genuinely important. I am not saying that illness is caused by negative thinking. I am not saying that people who develop serious diseases have failed to maintain sufficient positive emotional frequency. I am not suggesting that anyone is to blame for their physical suffering. Illness is complex. It is influenced by genetics, environment, exposure, chance, and dozens of factors that have nothing to do with a person's mental state. But illness also, in many cases, not all cases, has a psychosomatic component. The word psychosomatic has been misused as a dismissal, as a way of saying, it's all in your head. But its actual meaning is straightforwardly scientific. Body and mind are one integrated system, and events in one domain affect the other. Persistent emotional states alter physiology. Unresolved psychological conflict creates physiological tension. Chronic fear compromises immune function. These are not speculations. They are documented, researched, replicated findings in psychoneuroimmunology. a field that has spent 40 years mapping the specific pathways by which mental and emotional states become physical realities. What chronic illness sometimes communicates, not always, not universally, but often enough to be worth considering, is that the body is holding something the mind hasn't been willing to address. A relationship that needs to change, a situation that needs to end, a truth that needs to be spoken, an emotion that needs to be fully felt and released rather than suppressed. This is not a reason for guilt. It is a reason for curiosity. The question to ask of persistent physical symptoms is not, "What did I do wrong to deserve this?" but, "What might my body be trying to tell me that I haven't been willing to hear?" Sometimes the answer is nothing psychological. It's a virus, a genetic predisposition, a random cell mutation that has nothing to do with the story you are living. But sometimes the answer comes back as something specific, something addressable, something that, when attended to, changes the physical picture in ways that medicine alone had not managed. The body's own pharmacy. Here is a fact that deserves far more attention than it receives in mainstream discussions of health. Your body manufactures, on demand, based on your emotional and mental states, a remarkable pharmacopoeia of compounds that regulate pain, mood, immune function, cellular repair, and dozens of other physiological processes. Endorphins, natural pain relievers, more potent than morphine. Produced by exercise, laughter, genuine positive emotion, and the physical experience of being held or touched. DHEA, the vitality hormone, associated with longevity, resilience, and immune competence. Suppressed by chronic stress, enhanced by heart coherence and positive emotional states. Immunoglobulin A, a key component of mucosal immunity. Suppressed by anger and hostility, enhanced by compassion and care. Nitric oxide, a vasodilatory compound that protects cardiovascular health. Enhanced by genuine laughter and positive social connection. The point is not that you can think your way out of serious illness. You cannot. The point is that you are, at every moment, influencing your body's production of these compounds through the emotional and mental states you inhabit, and that this influence is not trivial. It is not a minor add-on to the real medicine. In many conditions, for many people, it is among the most powerful interventions available. The body is not waiting passively for external pharmaceutical interventions. It is already running a pharmacy, one that responds in real time to the frequency of the consciousness that inhabits it. A note on science, mystery, and the honest unknown. This book has drawn on neuroscience, quantum physics, psychoneuroimmunology, and consciousness research to make its central case. That thoughts are not passive, that consciousness participates in the construction of reality, and that the deliberate cultivation of mental and emotional states produces measurable changes in physical outcomes. I have tried to be accurate about what the science says and honest about its limits. Science is a method, not a belief system, and the method requires acknowledging uncertainty. Some of what I have described is well established and extensively replicated. Some of it is suggestive but not definitive. Some of it, particularly in the areas of consciousness research and mind-matter interaction, remains genuinely contested. I have my own view of where the weight of evidence lies. But I also know that the history of science is a history of confident certainties repeatedly overturned, that what was once dismissed as mysticism has, with regularity, turned out to be physics we hadn't developed, instruments to measure yet. So let me end with honesty. We do not fully understand consciousness. We do not fully understand how thought influences matter. We do not have a complete model of why the practices described in this book produce the effects they do in the people who practice them consistently. What we have is a convergence of evidence from multiple scientific disciplines, From millennia of human practice across virtually every culture and tradition, and from the direct lived experience of people who have applied these principles and found their lives changing in ways they could not have predicted, that points insistently in one direction. Your inner life is not separate from your outer reality. The signal you are broadcasting is not irrelevant to what you receive. The stories you tell about yourself are not just descriptions, they are instructions. And the most powerful work any human being can do, for themselves, for the people they love, for the world they inhabit, begins in the invisible laboratory of their own mind. Everything else follows from there.